The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Ms. Jeannie Pupil-Walker is here with us today. She has quite a story to tell, but she's going to talk about ESSA. But Ms. Pupil-Walker has worked for years and impacting the lives of English learners. She started as a Spanish teacher in Overton High School in Metro Nashville, and she has worked Overton, Glencliff. For a long time, she was the only bilingual person in the building, and so can you imagine that there were multiple questions brought to her and children brought to her? So she became an informal liaison and a family support person, a family engagement person, which later became her actual work in Metro in family engagement in the district office. And she's is now the Senior Policy Director at Conexión Américas in Nashville. She has been instrumental in the work of Conexión, and she's going to tell you the story of how Conexión has partnered with the State Department on ESSA and had an impact in that regard. But here we have a very experienced and knowledgeable, caring person in terms of English learners and their families. So I introduce to you Ms. Jeannie Pupil-Walker.
Thank you. All right, can y'all hear me okay? Great. So I'm excited to be here among teachers. I'm a former teacher, and I actually started my teaching career in Seattle Public Schools. I grew up in Nashville, but my first job was in Seattle Public Schools for 5 years teaching Spanish, and I taught a class called Spanish Heritage. How many of you have heard of Spanish Heritage before? So Spanish Heritage is a foreign language class for native speakers of Spanish, like I was. I grew up speaking Spanish, but I never learned to read and write it because I was educated in this country. And so my family's Cuban. And so in this class, native Spanish speakers will take this class and learn grammar and spelling and writing and composition and poetry and literature like they would in an English class. And they truly graduate being bilingual, be able to read and write as well as speak and listen the language. So that was sort of my entree into working with the communities here in Nashville. So, although we're in Murfreesboro today. So I want to start by thanking Laura. I want to give Laura Clark a round of applause. So this is a labor of love for her, and she is a teacher of teachers, and I love teachers of teachers. And I also want to thank you all. So what I've learned, and you'll hear about our story a little bit, is that teachers of English learners, teachers of immigrant students, are hands down the very best advocates in the state of Tennessee for immigrant families. And so you all are the ones that show up when students need help, when families need help. That was certainly the case in Morristown earlier this year when we had over 100 folks picked up by ICE and their children were at school, and who showed up to help were the teachers in Morristown, Tennessee, and Hamblin County. And so I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work you do. I know it's more than just a job for many of you, if not all of you. So I also want to start with a little exercise here. So I want you to, I don't know if you have an agenda in front of you or a piece of paper. I want you to think about a student. I want you to bring a student to the room right now because that's why we're here. Think about an immigrant student, an English learner student that has had an impact on you in one way or another. Write their name down and then turn to a neighbor and tell them about why that student is special to you. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that.
And her beginning of the year, Mia. Can you imagine? In words. And she's reading. I assume. Well, and it's like a blend too. It's like a... Had there been one more?
All right, thank you so much. So clearly we have passionate people in the room, right? And that's probably why you're taking time out of your summer to be here today and tomorrow. So thank you for sharing with me, and thank you for sharing with each other. So what I want to do here is cover a couple of things. Let me get my little clicker here. But I want to ask you to challenge yourself today. So I'm going to be talking Pretty meaty policy, wonky presentation about academic EL policy. Some of you will be in the advanced class and know what I'm talking about. Some of you will feel like this is too advanced for me, I don't know what this is about. This is for every single one of you, and the reason for that is that you must understand the policy that impacts your practice in the classroom every day. Because there are people in the Tennessee legislature and in Congress that are making rules and regulations on how you do your job. So you should know about what that means and how you could actually influence that process. So I want you to stay with me on this. Teachers often stay head down and focus on their students, and they don't really know a lot about how policy is made and what policy actually means and looks like. And so hopefully coming out of this, you'll have a better understanding and perhaps even an interest in raising your voice as a teacher, which is what I started doing. So, oh, by the way, so if you're a Twitter person, that's my Twitter handle. We also have Conexión Ed is our Twitter handle for our advocacy work at Conexión Américas. So the goals for today is, one, I'm going to talk about who we are as a coalition and an organization that we are. And by the way, I'll share with you that Laura is going to be sharing with you my PowerPoint by the end of the day today, so you'll have that with you. So you don't have to worry about taking pictures of the screen, unless you would just really like to do that. And then we're going to talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act and what it means for English learners. We're going to talk about the Tennessee ESSA plan, and then we're going to talk about what that might mean for you and how to get engaged on that information. So quickly about the organization that I work for, we're called Conexión Américas. We're based in Nashville. We're 16 years old. We do a whole range of programs and services for Latino families now across the state, but primarily we're housed in Nashville, Tennessee on Nolensville Road, if you've ever been there. And so we work in these buckets, social integration, civic, economic, and placemaking. I'm not going to go into each of these. My hat is I oversee our advocacy work, but I also oversee all of our school-based programs and our adult ESL programs. So we have parent engagement programs that we offer that's taught by parents to parents in Spanish. We run after-school programs in middle schools. We have college access staff in 3 high schools in Nashville. And we also have the contract with the state to provide services to children of migrant farm workers. So if you have migrant students in your school, in your district, it is our team that goes out and finds them on farms, that identifies them, that makes sure they're in school and they're getting what they need. We also help people learn English, buy houses, pay taxes, start businesses, and we also work very hard on the Nolensville Road corridor, making sure our community's voices are heard around transit, safety, being priced out of housing now in Nashville, which is a very serious issue, or priced out of their businesses. They can't rent their businesses anymore. So if you ever want to learn more, I encourage you to come and visit us. So then the other part of my job and what I came to Conexión Américas to do was to start an education advocacy division of the organization. And so we had always advocated on issues of immigration, whether it was against an English-only bill in Nashville, whether it was for in-state tuition for undocumented students, a whole range of issues we've advocated for and against. But we have never had a voice until 3 years ago on education issues for Latino students and English learners. So we started our shop, we call it the Tennessee Educational Equity Coalition. That's our website. There's a lot of information there that you can look at. One of the most popular pages on our website is an entire page with information for how to go to college if you're undocumented. If you have high school students who want to go to college, there are 20 plus colleges in Tennessee that will accept them and give them financial aid. There are private schools. So we have a map of those, and if you click on that map, you can see, for example, in Cumberland University, if you highlight that Cumberland University, you'll see the name of the person to call that can help your student. Okay, so that's one of the most popular pages on our website. So we started this coalition. We have about 65 partners statewide. They also serve African American students, students with disabilities, rural students living in poverty, and we also have about 1,800 members that we convene. We'll be in Knoxville tomorrow doing a workshop on updating people on ESSA. So we talk a lot about equity. Equity, as I say, is the coconut water of education these days. Everybody's talking about equity, and so not really people don't understand what it means, right? And so there is a difference between equity and equality. I'm not going to read this to you, but what we really believe is that every student should be able to achieve at the highest possible level, and every student gets there differently. So my example are my own children. I have a daughter and a son. If you have more than one child, you know that every child is different, even in the same house. My son needed a lot more prodding and poking and carrot and stick and whatever it was, right, to get him to the finish line. My goal for him was exactly the same as my goal for my daughter. But to get him there was a totally different skill set, right? I was good cop. Dad was bad cop. Sometimes we switched, right? My daughter, totally driven, unstoppable, high achieving, very driven to a fault sometimes, needed different kinds of support, right? But the expectation was the same. The expectation for our students should be the same. They graduate at a place where they're ready for the next chapter and they're successful in that next chapter. And what it takes to get them there looks different depending on the student. So we have 4 big policy priorities that we focus on, and so we provide research and data and information to our partners on each of these priorities. And so when we talk about excellent teachers, we do research on increasing the diversity of the teaching pool, getting more bilingual teachers. We talk about putting our most talented teachers in classrooms that need them the most. We talk about excellent teacher training and teacher prep programs, particularly for teachers who need support in working with, for example, English learner populations or students in low-income households. We talk a lot about accountability, which is what this presentation is about. Okay, and so I'll dig into that in a minute. We talk a lot about resources. We have students that need a lot more than other students sometimes, or different things, and so we talk about how do we equitably distribute resources and supports. And our newest one is around post-secondary access and success. We're digging into Tennessee Promise data now, and we're recognizing that Tennessee Promise is not going equitably to all students. You'd be surprised at who's actually getting Tennessee Promise at the end of the day and who's not, who's actually graduating from community colleges, from four-year colleges, and who's not. And so we're highlighting best practice and ways to raise the voices of communities to make sure all kids are going. So we're gonna do a little exercise here about ESSA. Every Student Succeeds Act. 0 means you don't know anything about it, you've never heard of it till today. A 5 means that you could get up here and do this workshop today. Where are you on this? Where are you on your ESSA journey? We got some fists, some 1s, some 2s. Be proud of your lack of knowledge. Okay, good, okay. I need to know that. So I need to know how to pace this presentation. So ESSA, Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, you probably learned that at some point, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson, by far the largest education law ever passed in the United States. And then on the other side is President Obama there with Lamar Alexander, who co-wrote the ESSA law, signing it into law in December 2015. So a lot has happened between those two signatures. So I'm not going to read all this to you, but the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, huge. It came into sort of in the war on poverty and the civil rights era, and it was meant as a way to make sure that all students had access to an education, a good education, and a lot of the energy went into providing federal dollars. Title I dollars for the first time came through ESSA in 1965, and initially that was basically a set of inputs. So we're going to give you the money, and this is how you can use it. 0 expectation on results for decades. Just here's the money. Get to work, right? That changed over time, and the ESSA became more about accountability for those dollars. And so No Child Left Behind was an iteration of ESSA, meaning it's reauthorized every so often. So No Child Left Behind, very famous. Everybody in here taught under NCLB back in the day when 100% of students were going to be right, on track, mastered. And so it was a huge turning point because it required that districts and schools show how every single student and student group was performing. So we disaggregated for the first time under No Child Left Behind, and we started using data seriously under No Child Left Behind. We also had sort of, I think, this culture of testing that came with that data, right? Which is still a legacy of No Child Left Behind today. And so it became outdated and unworkable, as you know, if you've been here for a minute. And so then under Obama, we were able to have what were called waivers from No Child Left Behind, meaning that the state could apply to get a waiver from the accountability and the framework, so that because in 2014 we weren't going to have 100% of kids proficient, right? So we need a waiver from that so that not every single school is labeled as a failing school, which was where that was headed, right? So 40 states received waivers, including Tennessee. And then we had the Every Student Succeeds Act pass. And so these bills don't just happen automatically. It is years and years of lobbying and advocacy and pushing. And so you had many, many groups advocating in Washington for this bill. And so Lamar Alexander and his counterpart, Patty Murray, on the Democratic side, were the co-sponsors. Their team, it was not them that wrote it, it was their staff that wrote the bill, received input from the PTA, from NEA, from the NAACP, from superintendents organizations, from school board organizations, from chambers of commerce. Everybody had a say in what they wanted to see in that bill. And so it passed by a large margin, which is kind of unheard of today, but it was a bipartisan bill. And so it put a lot of changes into place. But the primary change was that it pushed almost all of the power down to states. So every state had to then write an ESSA plan to comply with the law. And so Tennessee did that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But why does my organization and our coalition care about ESSA? Because it was an opportunity for us to sit at the table with the commissioner and her team to craft a plan for Tennessee that we felt we had the opportunity for a plan that might last for many years, to inform a plan that was more equitable and had the different student groups in mind as they wrote the policy. So it is fundamentally, from its inception, a civil rights bill, ESSA, and so it was a huge advocacy opportunity in Tennessee, and we were forming our coalition as the bill was passed. It was a really important moment, and it brought us together very, very quickly. So accountability is a term that's thrown around for better or for worse. Some people have a very negative association with the word. In the world of civil rights work that we do, accountability is very, very important, because if you come from a community where your neighborhood schools have been failing students for decades, where your students are graduating at abysmal rates, they're not reading on grade level, they are being pushed out, there are, we know that there are schools in this state where kids are just not being successful, and there's no accountability for that, typically, in the past. Under ESSA, we were hoping that accountability would prompt action. It would provide sort of expectations, prompt action, and prompt supports for schools to do the best they could with the students that they taught. So accountability communicates lots of messages, and it communicates expectations if it's well designed, and it prompts action, right? And that action can then direct resources and funding and training and all kinds of things for the school level, the district level, and the state level. So we knew this was an important moment. So we did our homework on what were the kind of levers within the Tennessee ESSA plan, according to the federal law, that we knew would make a difference for kids. So when we think about it, we think about what do we value most? What do we want to see most to be true for our students? And what are our expectations for the performance of our students? Are our expectations the same for every student? They should be, right? And how do we signal to parents and to the community and to schools and to students that we care about that and we want to do something if students are not being successful? And what does that look like if they're not being successful? And all of that had to be baked into an ESSA plan. And so let's talk for a minute about what the federal law required. The federal law is a huge document, and it's really important that you understand the big nuts and bolts of it. So it required, just like No Child Left Behind, that every school was evaluated for how it was performing, right? For all groups of students, federally designated students, right? So ethnic groups, students with disabilities, English learners, students living in poverty. And so you had to monitor and track how every group of students were doing, and you had to report that. And then under ESSA, for the first time, schools were to be rated, meaning they were to be compared one to the other, right? And in Tennessee, just before they wrote this ESSA plan, the legislature passed a bill to create A through F. Some of you may have known that. Schools were supposed to get a letter grade this fall, which is not happening, but we'll talk about that. So schools were supposed to be rated under ESSA, and minimally, we're supposed to identify the bottom 5% of schools in the state, right? And, which we call priority schools, and identify focus schools. Focus schools are schools that have a group of students, one or more, that are performing as if they were their own school, they'd be in the bottom 5% of the state, okay? So they have to identify these low-performing schools, and they have to identify strategies for improvement. Under ESSA, this is the federal requirement, okay? And so they also said in this law what states had to measure. So states had to incorporate these into their accountability framework. So they had incorporated achievement, right? That's based on an annual end-of-year assessment. Proficiency, straight up proficiency on an assessment. They had to have a different academic indicator as well. So for high schools, that was graduation rate. For K-8, it was typically growth. In Tennessee, that's TVOS. They, for the first time ever, and this is the result of lots of hard work and advocacy for English language and immigrant groups, states were accountable for how English learners were doing on learning English. So immigrant students show up 2 times on accountability now in Tennessee. They show up under T and Ready testing, but they also show up under their WIDA access, right? They show up twice on this accountability framework. And then fourth, and this was the interesting tug of war, every state had to choose an additional indicator or more of school quality. So the message again, this is signaling what's important. So the feds are saying, this is more than just test scores. We're talking about more than test scores. We're talking about other measures of how students are doing in your school. So Tennessee had to decide what that other measure would be, and that's where our work really began. So some people said, let's have an SEL measure. Let's have a measure of discipline. Let's have a measure of access to AP coursework. Let's have a measure of, there were superintendents that wanted to see a measure of teacher absenteeism, holding a school accountable for teacher absenteeism. There are still people that want that. And so we pushed back and said, what we want to see are measures where you can compare one school to the other and you can disaggregate that information. I can't disaggregate information on teacher absenteeism. I can't do it. Right? And so we need to see a measure that where we can compare groups and schools to one another. And so let's talk about the EL provisions in the federal law. There's a lot of them, so just get ready. So this is the hard work of national groups, and I personally went to DC because Tennessee advocates were asked to go over and over to DC to push Lamar Alexander, because we were his constituents, right? So I went multiple times to DC to talk with his staff about what we wanted to see in the federal law. So there's a lot of these slides for just a minute, but just bear with me. And I think you, of all the groups I've presented this to, will get it the best, because this is what you do, right? So it moves English learners from Title III to Title I, meaning they're not relegated in terms of the reporting and the funding and the accountability in a pocket under Title III. They're now part of all Title I accountability and reporting. That's a big deal, right? So some of these things Tennessee is already doing. It requires states to classify students using the same entrance and exit exam. So Rutherford County has to use the same entrance and exit exam as Davidson County, as Knox County, as Shelby County. So that if a student moves, we know where they are in terms of proficiency, right? Same entrance and exit requirements for every district, particularly for students that are highly mobile. It requires, this is the federal requirement, it requires schools to test students for EL services within 30 days of enrolling. We often do that the minute they arrive in Tennessee, but there are places where that does not happen. It requires states to adopt EL standards and an assessment. We've done that. We have the WIDA standards and the assessment. We've had that for a couple of years now. It requires states to set interim and long-term goals for their progress towards English language mastery. Now, if Tennessee's been doing that, we've never been able to find that information publicly. We don't know what goals the state has set. We don't know how students are doing towards those goals. ESSA requires the state now to publish that information. It requires states to demonstrate how they're going to support every school in meeting those goals, including for ELs that are long-term ELs. It requires states to report on the number of long-term English learners in their school, in each school, but they get to define what a long-term English learner is, okay? It requires the states to disaggregate ELs with disabilities from the overall EL group. That is new. And if you've been doing this work for any length of time, that's one of the biggest, most difficult tasks is what is a disability and what is a language issue, right? And so this is meant to drive, again, this is pushing states and districts to figure that out. How are we going to put systems in place where the exceptional ed or the special ed office is working with the EL office to identify those students? It's required now, okay? It allows states to include former ELs in subgroup accountability. So what that means is If you have, you're in elementary school and you have students that are being tested in 3rd and 4th grade, or let's say you're a middle school, you have 6th graders and 7th graders, and you have students that are English learners taking TN Ready, right? You can also include former ELs in that category. Now, advocates like us fought against that because we felt it masked how current English learners were doing. Tennessee opted to include former ELs in the current EL population for reporting how they're doing on TN Ready. So we could have a conversation about that at another time, but that is what Tennessee opted to do. So the state has to set goals for improving the percent of students that are making progress, and they have to establish uniform procedures for determining research-based targets. Like, how are you setting your target for growth on WIDA access? What evidence are you using? What research are you using? Based on what information? Based on the students you have. So Tennessee had to make that call based on, they had to show that they did the hard work of figuring that. They just didn't assign a random growth metric. So using those uniform procedures, they had to determine the maximum number of years it should take a student to exit EL, okay? Meaning, when do we define a student as a long-term EL student? At what point does that go into place? And an English learner who does not attain proficiency within that time period, right, cannot be exited unless they have to qualify. They can't just be exited based on, you've been in the EL for 10 years, you should probably just move on, right? You actually have to earn your exit. So these were the big considerations that Tennessee had to make to write this portion of the Tennessee ESSA plan. So they had to really sit down and study what the goals were going to be for EL students, the timeline for how quickly they exit. They had to define proficiency. They had to figure out how much in all of those indicators, those measures that we talked about, graduation rate, achievement, growth, how much did the EL portion weigh in an overall school rating, right? And what was Tennessee going to do for interventions for schools where ELs were struggling, right? That's a lot of responsibility. How many people work at the Tennessee Department of Ed on English learners? Anybody want to take a guess? 1.5, right? One of them, I think, is presenting here, Joanne Lucero. And so we advocated that the state needed lots more support to get this done. That is an impossibility for one person, 1.5 people to do. So let's talk about English learners in Tennessee, and this is not information that you probably already know this information. If you grew up in Tennessee like I did, you know that English learners were not part of the equation 20 years ago. They just were not part of the equation in any county, really. And so this is probably not news to you where they are in Tennessee, but they're growing in the southeast of the United States, has the fastest growing immigrant population of the country, particularly Latino students. Now, we can have a conversation, we won't, but we could, about the politics of this conversation. But the reality is immigrant families come to Tennessee because there's work and because they are pulled here. They don't just pick a random spot in Tennessee. Somebody has told them there are jobs here and there are jobs that we want you to fill in this state. That's why they come. And then typically men come and then they bring their families. And then they put down roots and then their children come to our schools. Right? And then you have, like I was, you have this first generation, these children that are the sort of at the switch of integration, where they are translating for their parents, right? You've all seen this. They are taking on adult responsibilities, much younger than our own children did, right? And they will grow up speaking 2 languages, and their children may not speak Spanish at all, right? And so that population, that first generation, that's who we're serving now. Now, if we were in Texas or in California or in Miami, this would be a different conversation. We're talking about 10 generations, right? But it's a new, what we call in this business, an emerging population, monolingual, Spanish-speaking adults, bilingual children, right? Or whatever language group it is. So this population continues to grow, and it's growing at a rapid pace. And so sometimes now we're starting to see that the children are entering, the families that have been here for some time now, the children are not entering requiring EL services. They're going straight into a traditional classroom, but their older siblings might have required EL services, might have not been born here. And then you can see where most EL students are, right? They enter and they're identified in kindergarten and they're exiting by 4th or 5th grade typically, or earlier sometimes. And these are the languages, the top languages that are spoken in Tennessee. And so most counties, and I'm assuming most counties here, don't have the bottom 8 languages, right? You primarily have Spanish-speaking families. We have refugee communities in Rutherford County, I know, certainly in Nashville and Knoxville and Memphis, but some of these are the Burmese. So Karen is a Burmese language, right? Kurdish is they're from Iraq, but so these are languages that are mostly found in big cities, except for Spanish. So let's talk about the Tennessee plan. All right, so some of these slides are straight off the Tennessee Department of Ed information that they've presented with me many, many times, this information for our coalition. So this was their strategic plan that the commissioner and her team made right before the ESSA plan came out. And these are their goals for students in Tennessee. And you may have seen this already. But the reality is that English learners are part of these goals, that they want to see English learners achieving at all of these levels. And so that's where this impacts you, right? And so the Tennessee ESSA plan is, I think, 280 pages long. It's longer than a lot of state plans. I've read other state plans. There are state plans that are 80 pages long, 60 pages long, which is not good. But they really put a lot of thought into this. And so these are the big buckets in the Tennessee ESSA plan. And so we'll talk mostly about accountability today, but they have information here about all of these elements that are to support schools and students. So a lot of people would say, well, I never knew they were writing a plan. Nobody asked me what I want to see in the plan. And so they actually did a whole engagement, sort of year of engagement, almost a year. And they did stakeholder input. They had information. You could log in on the website and submit information. You could go to regional town halls and meetings. We had people from our coalition and from many districts sit on working groups that helped write the plan. And then they created a draft plan and released it. People could give feedback, which we did at length. And then they had a final plan they had to submit to the U.S. Department of Ed. And that was to the DeVos administration. So that was a big question mark for us, how that would go, but it was approved. So our coalition, this is our timeline that corresponds with that timeline. So we met with the commissioner early on and said what we wanted to see and didn't want to see in the plan. We wrote, we gave feedback to the U.S. Department of Ed on what we want to see in the regulations with ESSA. We had members sit on working groups. We wrote public letters to Lamar Alexander, to Commissioner McQueen about the plan. Secretary of Education John King came here to Tennessee for a conference, and he met with us, and we told him what we wanted to see in the regulations. The draft plan was finalized, and then we began to train people across the state about what the plan included. And so this is what Tennessee, the commissioner and her team, decided. And this may be information you already know. But schools in Tennessee, this academic year that just finished, are going to be scored on these measures. So achievement on T and Ready, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. On growth, meaning TVOS, growth. And then a chronic absenteeism indicator, right, which is a first for Tennessee. And then ELPA, which is the English language measure, right? So every school will get rated on what we call ELPA, English Language Proficiency Assessment, but only if you have 10 or more ELs in your building. If you have 0 ELs in your building, obviously you're not going to be held accountable for that particular metric, right? And then if you're a high school, you're also measured on graduation rate, and then this new metric called Ready Graduates. How many of you have heard about the new Ready Graduate metric? So this is, if you work in a high school and you're seniors, this is not this year's seniors, but next year's seniors, if I'm graduating from that high school, how do I classify as a ready graduate? I either, 1, get a 21 or higher on the ACT, or I take 4 or more early post-secondary opportunities. AP classes, IB, dual enrollment, dual credit, INDRC certification, right? I have to have 4 of those to be classified as a ready graduate. So then the school is rated on the percentage of kids that are ready graduates. So what is that signaling to high schools in Tennessee? That's why accountability matters. It's signaling that graduation rate is not enough, that you actually have to do the work to prepare your students for life after high school. So those are what goes into the Tennessee report card. And this is how they're weighted, okay? So this is what the weighting looks like. So achievement, meaning TN Ready achievement is 45% of a school's rating. And growth is 35. And then chronically out of school is 10, ELPA is 10. So 10% of a school's rating is how their English learners are doing. That's a lot. That's the difference between back when we were going to do letter grades, an A or a B, or a D or an F, right? So it's going to be incumbent on schools to figure out how to help ELs proceed towards proficiency, right? It's also going to be important to figure out how to keep kids in school and come every day. All those things are signaling to schools what the state thinks is important. And so this is what they set up, and then we were supposed to have letter grades assigned to schools based on this fall. But we'll talk about that not happening here in a minute. So now, what did the state decide on all of those regulations on ELs? A lot, right? So they have to, so this particular ELPA, this indicator, measures progress towards proficiency, right? So how many students are making progress at the appropriate rate. And it's measured by the percent of English learners reaching proficiency weighted by the time in the program. So it's not, so people don't have the same rate of proficiency over time. As you know, kids learn early on and then they slow down a little bit. And so they weighted all of that, they baked that into the metric. So this is what TDOE proposed, that by 2025, 75% of ELs will be on this growth standard of reaching a 0.7 growth per year on the WIDA access. Okay, so that's kind of a wonky number, but that's what they expect to see. That is the goal for students across Tennessee. And so WIDA, as you know, is resetting their standards, and they've done some changes. They might adjust this baseline over time, but that is the goal for now, is that students by 2025 are making progress at that rate. This, just so you know, there are two ways that schools can, and this is true for all of these metrics. There's a growth pathway, or there's just a straight up absolute performance pathway. So for example, under chronic absenteeism, a school can choose, do we want to be rated on the number or the percentage of kids chronically absent, or do we want to be scored on the percentage that are improving over time, right? Because some schools have very high chronic absenteeism, but they're tackling it, so they're improving over time, so let them get credit for that, right? Same with ELs. So they can either have a value-added metric with AMO targets, or they can just have absolute. Are we achieving at this absolute rate, or are we showing growth over time and improvement over time, right? And so this is all information that is supposed to be reported this fall for every single school in Tennessee. And so long-term English learners, they will continue to define a long-term English learner as a student who has not exited ESL within 6 years. Okay, so if they come in at kindergarten, if they're still in EL after 5th grade, they're considered a long-term English learner. So beginning of their 7th year. So what that means is, I don't know, what would that look like in your school? Would that prompt any change in behavior, prompt any change in services? I have worked in high schools in Nashville where I'm working with freshmen who are in EL, and they've been in metro school since kindergarten. That's a problem. And so it turns out sometimes these kids have a disability, right? And that has never been diagnosed. And so that flag is important for that reason. Is there something else going on besides the fact that they're just not progressing? Maybe there's not, but it's important to find out. So that's what this signals, okay? So this is the data that they use to make this decision. What they're saying is, and this is the cohort of students that entered in 2010-11, that within 6 years, 20% were still in the EL program, right? So they're saying they think 6 years is an adequate number, is a fair number, it's not too hard on districts. Our advocates would argue that they'd like to see that number lower, meaning 5 years maybe, just so that that flag goes up earlier for that student. But this is the data that they use to make that decision. And then we'll talk about recently arrived English learners. So these could be kindergartners, not really, because they don't take tests, but it could be middle schoolers, high schools. So we all have students who arrive in 6th grade, 9th grade, 11th grade, right? And so at what point, so the federal law said that states could decide when they started counting on accountability under TN Ready, right? When do they take the test, and when does it matter when they take the test? So they had some options to choose from. So what Tennessee decided to do with recently arrived English learners is, in year 1, let's say it's a 6th grader, in year 1, they will take TN Ready, just to get a baseline. They will not show up in accountability, right? We're just getting information on them. In the second year, they'll be tested again, and they'll show up just on growth. This is under TN Ready, not on WIDA Access, okay? In the third year, they'll count in achievement and growth. Does that make sense? It used to be that they started under accountability pretty quickly. So this gives them a staggered, schools are not accountable for their achievement until the third year that they've been in the building, okay? And so they're sort of working on what this will look like and how to track these students, especially if they move from school to school. And so then let's talk about this legislation. How many of you are familiar with the legislation that the legislature passed during the fun times with TN Ready testing this spring, okay? So the legislature literally within 24 hours passed 2 bills, right? And they were hearing from, it was very interesting because they were hearing from, so the Democrats and Republicans voted almost unanimously. I think there were one person that didn't vote for these bills. So they were hearing from PTAs and from teachers' unions, and they were hearing from superintendents and school board members that A through F is not good, and that the testing is not working, and we shouldn't be held accountable. It shouldn't go into a school's grade, or a teacher's evaluation, or a student's grade. So what they did was they prohibited in this bill, HB 1981, SB, so House bill and Senate bill, that student performance and student growth could not be used to assign an A through F letter grade this fall. Period. End of story. There will be no letter grades this fall. It prohibits student performance and student growth data from being used to identify a priority school or a focus school. So those schools will not be identified this fall. We will not identify any priority schools this fall. And it prohibits districts from firing teachers based on test scores. So that's a big deal, right? And then the second bill that was passed was this no adverse action bill, which was sort of to reinforce this bill, which was that you could not have any adverse action taken against a school or a teacher or a student based on test results from this year. So you could not penalize a school, identify a school, penalize a teacher. So that is the result of the testing, the issues with the administration of the online test this year. What a lot of people don't realize is 50% of the tests taken this year in Tennessee were on paper and pencil. And then many of the online administration actually worked. So it was actually a pocket of students who had issues in districts and schools with the test, but it was not a universal issue. But the state felt like it was really important to implement and pass these 2 laws. And it happened like that. And so there's a lot of worry on the advocacy side of the House that people will begin to lose confidence in the test, right? And the results of the test, if they haven't already. And we're just trying to help separate the actual test itself from the online system, right? It's 2 different things. Are we talking about the quality of the assessment, or are we talking about the administration of an online assessment, right? We're worried that whatever test scores come out next year, the following year, will never be used to take serious action, for better or for worse, in a school when students are not doing well. So we're concerned about this like everybody else is. So what are they going to do instead? What do they decide to do instead? So they're very creative, and they said, we're not going to assign an A through F, we're going to give a 0 to 4. So there's not a summative rating. There's not a final, like A through F would have had a final summative grade. Under A through F, each of those metrics, chronic absenteeism, ELPA, achievement, growth, you got a letter grade for each of those, like a report card, and then you had a final summative grade. In this policy, every metric, including achievement and gets a 0 to 4. But it's not a final summative grade. Now, people can do the math, right? And average, right? That can happen. I don't know if people will do that, but it could be done. And so, so this is just for this fall. And I think a lot will depend on who's elected governor and what the next legislature looks like, if A through F will come back, and if changes will be made yet again. We're worried about that instability being created. So this fall, the state will release brand new dashboards for every school. And on that dashboard will be these numbers assigned by measure. And they'll break those out, right? So you'll see an all student grade and you'll see a student subgroup grade as well, or letter, or number, I should say. So what else is happening? So the TDOE has released, and maybe you've seen it, they have an implementation guide on their website for English learner, for EL teachers, with some toolkits and information and terminology and best practice and so forth. They've got a webinar, I think, or two on their website, and they are supposed to be really helping embed EL instruction and so forth into the larger sort of teaching. I think we agree in this room that every teacher is an EL teacher, right? If you've got English learners in your school, every teacher is responsible for having some understanding of how language acquisition works and how to help English learners. And so we think having 10% of the rating will provide a little more push for people to see that student body as part of everyone's responsibility. So Tennessee submitted their ESSA plan. It was approved. This past year was the first year under ESSA, and the results will come out in November, not till November. How about that? So stay tuned for that. And then, so this is information for advocates. You may see yourself as an advocate, you may not. This is what we tell folks. How to make sure ELs are successful in schools, is to create a welcoming environment for them and for their families. And there are schools that do this really, really well, and other schools that have a ways to go, right? In terms of making sure information is translated, making sure front office staff have the ability to communicate or help families that come in, making sure that families feel included into the culture and traditions and the rituals of the school. People need to know how Title III funds are being spent and on what and why. And if that's tied to the instructional program and tied to the goals of the school. They need to know how ELs are doing. Once this dashboard comes out, we'll actually see school by school how well English learners are doing. We think it's important to push that professional development should be for ELs, should be for all teachers. All teachers should have some professional development on working with ELs. And we think that that Title III money should really go towards working with families and communities as well as straight instruction. And then the last one is, we really believe in empowering parents with information that is useful for them. I will tell you that if you've ever asked an immigrant parent why they took such tremendous risk and sacrifice, the number one reason is for their children. And so it's the most important thing for them is that their children are successful in school. They understand that is the ticket, the primary ticket to success, but they often don't know how to help their child. And so there's a saying in Spanish, if I'm talking about somebody's child and I say they're bien educado, it sounds like I'm saying they're well educated, but that's called a false cognate. It's actually not well educated, it means they're well behaved, because your education starts at home, right? And so often immigrant families will come and the first thing they'll ask you is my child behaving well in your classroom? Because that's a reflection on the family. But then we talk about learning, right? But it's very important that they're sending you their very best child that is very well behaved and respectful and hardworking. Now, not every child is perfect, but that is the goal of parents. So the absolute humiliation and frustration when kids get into trouble and get expelled or get pregnant or are caught with drugs, it is excruciating for immigrant parents when that happens because of the shame, because they have risked everything for this child, right? And then somehow things went off the rails. And so parents really need to know how to communicate with the school, how to partner with the school, because that is their primary reason for being here, is for their children. So even if they don't cross the threshold of the door, please know that the most important thing for them is their children, okay? And so we have a little bit of time for questions. So I will take questions at this point. Yes?
When you're talking about the 7th year being the year kind of for the long-term English learner, will that count as an extra added or weighted percentile on the teacher's accountability? Okay.
No, so one of the things I didn't talk about was that there's accountability and then there's reporting. So accountability is only those measures, schools are only rated on those measures. Then there's a whole lot of other stuff that is reported. So they will report number of EL students with disabilities. They will report number of long-term English learners. They will report suspension and expulsion data. They will report all kinds of information that the school is not held accountable for, but that advocates and parents and community members can see to make judgments on what needs to be happening. Yes?
You mentioned that instead of Title III, we'll be under Title I now? And how's that
Under
gonna work?
accountability. So, under accountability, right. So they still receive resources and funding, and there's Title III money is to be directed towards districts and schools for serving ELs. But under accountability now, they are all, under a school improvement plan, they are under Title I, right? So in your Title I school improvement plan, like, how are you helping English learners in your school improvement plan? Yep. Other questions? Yes.
I'm curious as to how you would assist a neighboring county in advocating for our immigrant populations and families. Conexión is so embedded and so involved in Davidson County, and I'm sure beyond, and maybe even statewide. But in developing an advocacy or a voice in a neighboring county.
So we have some materials on our website that you can see about, it's a whole handout on English learners and the English and this plan. A lot of the information you saw today is from that. But we are happy anytime to come out and train folks, to do a roundtable and talk about, let's look at the data from this county. Let's talk about how we can pull together and come together to really support these students. And so I want to be clear that we are not talking about accountability in terms of being punitive. We're talking about accountability in terms of knowing where we are and what are we going to do once we have that information. Every single school can improve in some form or fashion, but the only way we know what to do is if we have really good information. That's why we're so worried about this test, because it's very hard to hold schools accountable. And let me be clear, there are schools in our state that are not serving students well, right? There are students that are just not excelling, let's put it that way. And so what happens if that information is faulty and nobody's accountable? And that's how it was pre-NCLB. Like, there was no disaggregation, there was nothing, right? So we don't really want to go back to those times where we don't know, and this includes for students with disabilities, right? For example, the disability community is very worried about test scores not being reliable, seen as reliable and valid, because then they can't argue for more services or better services or different services, because people can just say, well, this is not valid data. Why are you counting on this data? It's not valid. That's a really big problem for advocates. Really big problem. Yes?
In your opinion, now that ESL is moving from Title III to Title I, will the money will it help ESL that we're coming under Title I financially?
It should. Yep, it should. Yep. You would think that it would be baked into the Title I sort of school improvement plan. The ethos of the plan is that all students are going to be helped, that we're not relegating English learner students to this one little bucket of money. Good luck with that $10,000, right? That we are part of the broader school community. Even when students exit the program, we know they still need help. They should be part of under the umbrella of Title I.
So even if your school is not a Title I school, how does that work exactly?
I don't know. That's a different question. Yeah. Yep. She said, so what if you're not a Title I school? That's really hard. It's hard to imagine that you're a Title I school with EL students. It's interesting.
Because
combination.
I have 60 ESL students every day, and we're not a Title I school. So now does that mean, oh, well, you don't have any money, so good luck, you know? How does that going to be affected?
Other questions? Yes?
How do you go about accessing the report that will come out in November?
So she asked, how do we access the report that will come out? So this will be really interesting, and so we are actually working right now to make sure that information is widely known. So right now, how many of you go on the state report card to look at your district's report card, your school's report card? Good, that's good. But most people don't. And even when they go there, it's kind of hard to use. And so I think that there are going to be, much less so now, I think before when there were going to be A through F, districts would have just not talked about those grades being released. They would have suppressed that information if it was not good news. So we want to see that information shared widely. So those dashboards will be on the state report card. Now it's up to districts and schools to promote that dashboard. So what we'll be doing is creating a side-by-side tool. We know that about 50% of people will look at that dashboard on their phone, and the state is preparing it so that you can read it on your phone. We want to create a side-by-side tool with the questions that families and community members can ask per metric. What are the 3 questions we should be asking about chronic absenteeism? What are the 3 questions we should be asking about ELs, right? How can we dig into this data and understand what we can do to help? And so that information, it'll be released, but we'll just see how much the districts and schools kind of share it. I mean, it's open to anybody, but it's a matter of, will that be widely known? I don't know. Other questions? So your job as teachers then is to form an opinion about all of this. So we get asked all the time, like, hey, will you, like we were literally asked by Shelby County executive team to come in and train them on ESSA. And I said, we have a position on ESSA. Like, we have an agenda. We're not a trainer. We're actually like training advocates, right? To talk to the superintendent, right? And so you should see yourself as advocates. If you think that based on what comes out this fall, you have thoughts on how maybe the accountability system should be adjusted or changed, or resources should be readjusted or changed, use that evidence and that information to ask for that. Right? Use that information. For the first time ever, we will be able to see how English learners are doing on WIDA access on every single school's report card. That is a first. And so what do we do with that information? Right? Do we own it, or what do we do with that? And that's partly your job too, to have that conversation. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank you.